And welcome back to Capitol Tonight. The nation's top military officer said today that U.S. policy on transgender individuals serving in uniform has not and will not change until the military receives more clarity from the Trump administration. According to President Trump's tweets, he is calling for a ban on transgenders serving in the military because of, quote, tremendous medical costs and disruption associated with transgender troops. My next guest is supportive of the ban. We heard last night from a little bit of a different perspective. Stephen Hayford is legislative director with New Yorkers for Constitutional Freedoms. He is joining us now to explain his position. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Liz.
So is this an ideological point of view for your organization, or is this about military readiness?
Well, I think it's first of all about military readiness. The president was correct in saying that it is disruptive to have somebody identifying as a member of the opposite sex when they're serving in the armed forces. And I think those of us who haven't served in the armed forces have to remember that this isn't like working next to somebody on an assembly line or working in the next cubicle over in an office. Military service members are in close quarters with each other. And to have a member of the opposite, biologically, a member of the opposite sex, living in opposite sex quarters, using opposite sex facilities, showering next to people of the opposite sex. This is something that is an invasion of privacy for the other service members.
Do you have hard and fast evidence of that, though? I mean, for example, you know, I've seen many interviews now with service members, past and current, and they seem to be performing just fine. And they don't seem to have their privacy violated, and there seem to be accommodations made. And if they can handle the job, just like women in combat is, you know, now being handled, then why not allow them to do that?
I think that, first of all, this policy from President Obama was still being implemented. So I don't know that we've seen all the impact of that policy play out yet. However,
but you don't personally have any knowledge of hard and fast evidence of disruption.
I don't know that we can have evidence of something that hasn't happened yet, but I think it's inherently disruptive when you have, and this is well documented, when the military instructs, as part of their rollout of this policy, instructs service members to accept, and I quote, having opposite sex service members showering next to you, for instance, if that person identifies as transgender. How can that not be disruptive?
But it is, I know you're saying they were rolling it out, and it is true that certain aspects of the implementation were actually in fact delayed in terms of what kind of impact it would have on the armed forces. That said, there are thousands of transgender military members currently serving, so we have some idea about how this is or is not being disruptive.
I'm not sure about the numbers. I've seen a variety of numbers as to how many service members, and so I'm not sure if it's thousands or what stage those service members are at in terms of their gender identities and transitions. But I guess I would suffice it to say I think it's a little early to be able to see the full impact of a policy that's just still being rolled out.
What is your response then to folks like Sean Patrick Maloney, who we heard from last night, the congressman, who say that this is bigoted, that this is prejudicial, and it happens to come on the anniversary of the desegregation of the military, that there are people who are currently honorably serving. I mean, we may not know the exact number, but certainly we know that there are some trans military members who are currently serving, and it's a slap in the face to say to them, your services are no longer wanted or needed.
The answer to that, I think, is a couple of things. First of all, we need to be really clear when we're talking about gender identity. We're talking about something that is not an immutable, unchanging characteristic. This is not like race. It's not like skin color. It's not like ethnicity. A person doesn't decide their ancestry when they get up in the morning.
Well, trans people would say they didn't decide one way or another. They were born a certain way and that they were locked into the wrong body, that in fact that their actions are just enabling them to live their authentic selves.
Well, and let me put it this way. I wasn't about to say that people chose to have gender dysphoria, but what I was about to say is we do choose what clothes we put on in the morning. A person may have feelings of gender dysphoria. How they choose to handle that, whether they choose to approach it from the perspective of living out or attempting to live out life as a member of the opposite sex, or seeing the gender dysphoria as something that they need to work through and overcome, that's a personal choice. And I would say to you, I read an article, and I don't remember the name of the person who spoke on it, but someone who was in the military for a long time and now identifies as transgender. And I was struck by the fact, of course, the person is upset about this policy change, but this person did not live as a member of the opposite sex while in the armed forces and managed to function. What did people with gender dysphoria do before President Obama made this change?
Some of them served and lived in secret.
And so which is more, I guess there's several questions here, but the first thing I really want to emphasize is and I don't mean this as a jab at you, Liz, but I think it's, to make an analogy with race is offensive, and I think it's an overreach to draw that comparison.
What do you make? Forgive me though, because it seems that that this is based, as I mentioned at the outset, on money and the cost of health care. And what do you make of the numbers that we've seen from the RAND survey, that actually it's a mere fraction of the many billions spent on healthcare by the military annually? The portion spent on transgender healthcare is actually quite small. That, according to the report and according to the congressman, as we heard him cite last night, the amount that it spends on erectile dysfunction medication, for example, is considerably more.
Well, the answer to that is that if you're spending money on something that you shouldn't be spending money on, the number of dollars that should be spent is zero.
But isn't this an ideological discussion that would be best decided by, well, the Joint Chiefs, for example, that it would be good to involve the Joint Chiefs? Apparently, reportedly, they had no idea that this is actually something that the president was considering, or that would be publicly creating policy via a tweet. Or even if you wanted to legislate this, that you could have this debate in Congress. I mean, is there not room to have a discussion about it?
We certainly think that there should be debate and discussion in Congress about this, and we think that the president's decision should be codified. And I want to make this clear as well. It's problematic when we talk about this as a discrimination issue. This is about a behavior. People decide whether they want to act upon this or whether they don't, how they approach this issue. And it has an impact on the other members of the armed forces besides the individuals involved. And I would disagree.
We actually don't know what that impact is, since they had delayed actually the report on said impact.
But as a woman, can you acknowledge that there would be some impact if there's female service members being asked to shower alongside men who identify as transgender?
As a woman, I could say that I think that people who can do a job, who demonstrate their ability to do a job, should have the right to do that if they want to serve their country.
And we would agree with that, but then that person has to meet the expectations of the military just like everybody else.
But we did not know what the expectations of the military were. In fact, we don't know what they are now either, because at this point it is so murky as to have a tweet from the president that the White House can therefore not subsequently say, well, what's going to happen to the thousands, whatever that number is, of people who are trans and currently serving, and what's going to happen tomorrow when the Joint Chiefs say we're not changing anything at this point.
Well, and point taken, President Obama's policy was implemented fairly recently, and so people who entered the armed forces after that, there's certainly, we would want to be sensitive to those individuals and individuals who have relied on that policy. But I want to get back to the born this way argument, Liz, because I don't buy it, and I don't think there's any scientific basis for saying that somebody is born with a gender identity that's different from their sex.
But what does that have to do with a discussion about whether or not they were born a certain way?
It affects the discussion in terms of whether this is discrimination based on an immutable characteristic, or whether it's discrimination based upon a chosen behavior.
But discrimination in any form should not be tolerated based on a person's free will of their choice. They make a choice, and then subsequently they should be treated as a human being, should they not?
They certainly should be treated as a human being. That's not the issue. The military discriminates in many different ways. If I try to join the armed forces tomorrow, Liz, they're going to tell me a lot of things that might be seen as discriminatory. They're going to tell me I'm too old, I'm too heavy, and I got flat feet. They're going to discriminate based on all these things, and they're going to tell me that I probably have to get rid of my facial hair, which I really like having facial hair. Would I say that it's discrimination?
But you make a personal decision as to whether or not you want to keep it, and as to whether or not
Yes.
you want to lose weight. The age thing, I don't think you can do anything about.
I really can't. But I decide what I put on in the morning too. A person with gender dysphoria doesn't have to act upon that. They could choose to go in a different direction.
They say differently, though. And all I can say is this.
And there are many people who are very dissatisfied with having made these transitions.
I understand that. But I can say this. Neither you nor I, as far as I know, can personally attest to the experience of being trans. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So really, for us to hypothesize about whether or not it's a choice is impossible.
I don't agree, because I want to point back to the science. And you asked me a question on science earlier, and I want to pose the same question, not to you, but just I don't see any science that states that a gender dysphoria condition is something that's immutable or unchanging or necessarily inborn. And it's important to make the distinction. Just because something's not inborn doesn't mean that it's chosen. I would never suggest that somebody woke up one morning and decided they wanted to have gender dysphoria. Of course, it's got to be an extraordinarily challenging and complex situation to face, but that doesn't mean that it's inborn or that those feelings necessarily are lifelong for that person.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but this same debate is going on many levels. It's really divided military officials, as far as I can tell, and I'm pretty sure it's not over. So I very much appreciate you coming in and providing another view on a difficult and controversial conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz.